Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Hi, friends. I've been so excited to share with you today my conversation with author and artist, Bette Dickinson. Since we'll be walking through her Advent devotional this year on Faith and Feelings starting next week, I wanted to give us the chance to get to know her a little bit before we begin. And wow, Bette brings such wisdom and depth into this conversation. I want to invite you to take your time listening and really pondering what she offers us today. Bette emphasizes that preparation for the Christmas season can often feel busy and frantic, but it doesn't have to be this way. She invites us to imagine Advent differently, to pause, to listen, and to notice the unfolding of God's plan in our lives. As a quick side note, Bette has generously shared a discount code for listeners, 25% off any resources on her website, including the book, through December 1st with the code MRA25. You can find the link in the show notes. So let's go to my conversation now with Bette. Well, Bette, I'm so glad to have you on Faith and Feelings today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Well, as you know, we're going to be walking through your Advent devotional this December on the podcast, and I've been so looking forward to this conversation with you. So to get started, for those who may not be familiar with you or your work, could you share a little bit of your story and what draws you to the season of Advent?
Yeah, so I am an artist and writer, and one of the things that I love to do is to create spaces for people to encounter God through creative forms. And I started a nonprofit called Awakening the Soul, where we seek to awaken the souls of ministry leaders through beauty and wonder. And so a lot of the work I do is developing resources and experiences for people to connect with God and with one another. And in particular with Advent, I love the season because I think Advent means waiting or expectant waiting. And I think in our culture, we often have a little bit of a resistance to the idea of waiting. And yet, as I think about the incarnation and the beauty of what God has done, it's just one of those large concepts that I think requires some time and soul preparation to really receive it well. Because I think, the Christmas season can get full of a lot of other things, and then Christmas Eve service and Christmas is come and gone. Whereas I think that there's just this, perhaps a space to get in touch with our deeper longings of what are we waiting for, and how do we need Emmanuel, God with us, to show up in our lives again right now in this present moment.
One of the things I really loved about this devotional is the way you invite us to engage all of our senses as we read. And I'm curious how your background as both an artist and a writer shaped the way you approached the writing of this book.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I feel like they're often having conversations with one another, the art and the writing, and in the preparation for it, a lot of times, just in the background in my mind, I'm thinking about what I've learned about how the brain works in terms of spiritual. How are we formed? How do we process information? And one of the fascinating things that I've been discovering, and neuroscientists have discovered over the last 15 years, is that we process information from the right side of the brain to the left. And the right side of the brain are things like our emotions, our encounters with the body, our imagination, creativity, and then, so we have this sort of embodied encounter that is pre-verbal. And then our left side of the brain, which is our words, analytical thinking, belief systems, sort of kick in to make sense of what we just sensed, as Dr. Kurt Thompson often says. And for me, I've just really felt that I wanted to lead people through this sort of full-brained, full-bodied encounter with God that isn't just words, but is truly an experience on the right side of the brain, which is sort of what the paintings do in the book. But it's also sort of how I connect with God and process my own experience with him, so that when I'm creating, I'm trying to unpack what I'm feeling and experiencing with God in a nonverbal way, so that then the words and scripture can kind of help us unpack or open up that experience. And I mean, the truth is, if you think about the Gospels and how they were written, they're having a left brain explanation for a right brain experience that they just had with God. And so how we, I think, need to create space for that, or make room for that, to use the verbiage from the book. We need to make room for those kinds of encounters ourselves that help us to get into our bodies and in creativity and connect with God in that relational way.
Can you tell us a little bit about the paintings
Yes.
in each day of the devotional?
Yeah. So the paintings are both sort of this combination of an abstract form and a concrete form together, which is something I love to do. And for me, what that represents is there's something happening in the physical level in the story, but then in the background of these paintings is sort of this abstract form where I was trying to depict, if you were to visualize how the Holy Spirit was showing up in this moment, or how God was present, or the movement of God, what would that look like? And so there's these forms of light moving throughout the piece and interacting with the characters. And I think that that's sort of how it is with us, that there's this story going on the physical level with us and our lives and the things that we're wrestling through. But then there's this deeper spiritual layer that we often don't see. And so the paintings are liquid acrylic on clay board, which is a clay material that I mix up and paint. And it's a lot of water, in almost like watercolor, with the movement of the acrylic underpainting. And then the characters are sort of painted in with the oil paints over the top. And so, so in particular with Luke's gospel, I really felt this beautiful story emerging of the characters, Mary, Zechariah, Elizabeth, even the character Luke and his telling of it, are these figures that have their own human longings and desires, and how deeply personal God met each of them. You know, with Zechariah showing up in sort of one of the first entries, he's got this longing, that's very hidden, of this ache to have a child. And so he and Elizabeth have this sort of tension of doing all the right things and yet feeling like God's not answered their prayers, which is a parallel to what's happening to the people of Israel at the time of this expectant longing. And really, which sets the stage for all of us for the Advent story. I think all of us have times in our lives, or maybe we're at this place right now where we have a deep longing that isn't being met, where we're waiting for something. And so I really think Zechariah and Elizabeth's story helps us to get in touch with that. And then, of course, Mary's story, there's several paintings of her that really capture her own journey of encountering the angel. And, if I were to step into her story, trying to figure out what would it look like to be in a space where, by all human standards, I'm not qualified to be the mother of the Messiah. And what does that mean? And then to see her emerge into her story as the pieces and as the story evolve, where she sort of raises to sing this beautiful Magnificat, which is this incredibly biblically grounded, theologically expansive song. So it really, all the paintings sort of follow these trajectories of the characters like Zechariah, Elizabeth, Mary, even the shepherds, and their story of God meeting them in the midst of their longings and coming to them and empowering them. And what does it look like for God to become flesh within their real flesh and blood presence in the world, which is the invitation for us today too, still.
Yeah, and for listeners who might not have the book yet, these paintings are so beautiful. So how would you invite listeners to engage with these paintings as they're going through the book?
Yeah, I mean, my hope would be that the paintings help people slow down a little bit, and especially the Christmas season is just so full and it's so fast paced. And I find for myself in this season of intensity and lots going on that when I sit down to pray, my mind is filled with all kinds of to-do lists and, I got to go to, do this event for my kids' school, and I got to go do this, and I got to prepare these gifts, and I got to decorate, and I got to, and the hope is that the paintings really, truly create some space in our souls to help our brains to slow down, to open ourselves up where we might not necessarily have words yet, but really to prayerfully meditate on them and breathe through them and allow our mind to wander through the piece in a way that can kind of anchor us in the present moment, which I think the arts have a beautiful capacity to be able to do that in ways that words sometimes don't, is to just anchor us in this present moment with God and to have an encounter with him through the paintings, to see ourselves in the stories of these characters, to see and open ourselves to the way the Spirit is moving, not only in the piece itself, but within our own story, and find that place of connection with the characters and with the Spirit, connecting with them in a way that then, as we get into the text and unpack that in the pages after that, can kind of help us make sense of hopefully an encounter we've just had with the paintings.
I'm really curious about your writing process as you created these 25 devotions. Was there one in particular that felt especially personal or vulnerable for you to write?
Yeah. Well, so for those of you who haven't read the book or know this story, I mentioned this in the introduction, but when I first started working on the painting of the Annunciation, where Mary finds out that she's going to birth the Messiah, in the very moment that I was working on that painting, this was in 2017, I thought, I think I might be pregnant. And I found out that day that I started that piece, I was pregnant with my son, Winston. And so it then led me on this journey in creating the work in a truly deeply embodied way, where I am walking alongside Mary, painting about her story, writing about her story, while I literally am, growing a child within me. And I think there was just a beautiful, personal, and vulnerable invitation to collaborate with God in that way, in that I will never, there's nothing, I'm not going to have moments like that, frequently in my life. Hopefully, I don't know how many children I'm going to have, but, I think that there's this space where God was inviting me to experience some of the vulnerability of pregnancy, to experience not only the physical vulnerability of that, but the spiritual and sort of metaphorical implications of birthing something new is a vulnerable place. You feel your limits more severely. Your body is just, you have to surrender to this transformation that's happening. And so I think, especially in journeying alongside Mary, particularly in the Annunciation piece, is this moment of reckoning with God's wanting to birth something new in all of us in different times in our lives. Are we willing to surrender and open ourselves to him changing us and creating something new? And Paul even says that he's in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in us, right? So this isn't just for Mary, this is for us now. And so I think that there's a continual, and I think too, even as a woman in ministry, in a world that is still very dominated by sort of male patriarchal figures, I think it's been really beautiful to sit with Mary's story and see how God used her in a culture that was, where women had no voice, was just deeply beautiful for me.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Such an embodied parallel process.
Absolutely. Yep.
I'm wondering, as you think about this moment in the world, if there's maybe one devotion or theme in the book you'd invite us to pay particular attention to this year?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it's a very tumultuous time, as we know, in our world. And I think in particular, I really resonate with John the Baptist's story, and even the prayer over his life in the early chapters in Luke, that he would be one who would prepare the way for Jesus. And that what that meant was that he would call out where there is not a level road for the kingdom to arrive. And, even the reference back to Isaiah's prophecy that the mountains would need to come low and the valleys would be raised up. And what's fascinating about, if you look more into John's story in Luke, part of how he calls that out is very practical justice issues. It's like, okay, so tax collectors don't take more than you need, or are supposed to. Soldiers don't abuse the people that are under you. And it's very, as he's preparing the way for Jesus, he is reckoning with there's a power imbalance happening. And I think in our world right now, we need, the one that I would focus on would be sort of making room for prophets and preparing and making the room for preparation. Those two, where what does it look like now to prepare the way for Jesus again? Because he's coming back. So what does it look like to make a world that is just, where everybody has equal access to God's resources, to love and belonging, to access to the kingdom, where it's an upside down kingdom, where Jesus came for the poor and the oppressed and those on the margins. And I just think, wow, in our world right now, there's a lot happening that isn't making space for those that are intentionally pushing those on the margins out. And as a people of God who are a part of the Jesus way, how do we go out of our way to welcome those on the outside in? And even, the shepherds would be another one, right? So they're the first ones to receive the message, and they're the most marginalized in society. So where are we going out of our way to make sure that the stranger, the foreigner, the refugee, the immigrant, the widow and orphan, how are we welcoming them to the table and to beholding Jesus, not just spiritually, but physically and in all levels of society?
So good, Betty. That's such a needed reminder. If I'm remembering correctly, I think Making Room in Advent came out 3 years ago. So I'm curious about what your Advent process looks like right now. Has it evolved or changed any since writing this book?
Yeah. It's so interesting because when I first released it, I asked my spiritual director, okay, now that the book is out, what do I do with my time? Because it had been so preoccupied, and I think it was even in the lead up to it. She's like, well, I think you need to read the book. And I did not expect how much God would return to me what I had already poured into the book, that my own words would come back to me and where God would minister to me again. Because the thing about writing, if you're doing it in partnership with the Spirit, there's things that you put in there that you aren't necessarily your voice. I mean, they come through your voice, but it's led by the Spirit. So those same words have power to come back to minister to you again, if they're not your inspiration. And so I think I read through the book every year, and God meets me in different ways. And I think also it allows me to step into a place of gratitude for the gift of what God gave me in the book, because the reality is so much of my story is woven in of God's own journey that he's led me on, times of waiting and times of embracing my limitations like Mary, or times of needing to prepare the way, or times of making room for justice. And what does that mean now? And I think, and I've heard this from other people who've read the book, as they read it every year, they get a new marker, a different color marker for every year, because God speaks different things through each time. And especially with the paintings too, because the paintings are so open to the Spirit using it in different ways and speaking different ways. And you can see different things every time you look at a new piece, or a piece again and again. And so I think for me, especially in this season right now, I just released another book this past September, and I'm in this time of really needing to slow down after sort of releasing that. And I'm just looking forward to this December to just taking a breath and to practice those breath prayers that are in the book and to have space to behold the paintings again. And honestly, we have on my website, we've released these breath prayer cards that have all of the paintings on them and then the breath prayer. And we do it as a family over dinner. And I have my kids share with me what they see in the paintings. And it's just beautiful to have those conversations. And for kids, especially, art can be such a tool and a resource that helps them light their imagination up and gives them a chance to share what they're seeing. And it feels like a little bit more of a level playing field than just words. And so I love hearing from my kids how God meets them through the paintings. And yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm thinking about the listener who might be new to Advent or maybe feeling a little hesitant about slowing down this December. And I'm wondering what encouragement you would offer as they consider beginning this journey.
Yeah. Well, I would say, I think sometimes I feel like Christmas can get hijacked by our culture. And I don't mean that in a us versus the culture kind of thing, but I just think the noise and the pace are not how God would have invited us to spend this time with him, and to trust that when we do make the space and maybe turn off the phone or just get up a little bit earlier, or even just creating some intentional practices throughout the day, even if you don't have a ton of margin, of doing a breath prayer while you're doing the dishes, that's or going for a walk, and breathing with the breath prayer. I think that the more present we can be in this moment and grounding ourselves in the present moment with our breath and with our imagination, I think, as people say, like you get out what you put in. And so the more we can give ourselves the space and to trust the process of waiting, even ways that feel maybe uncomfortable or feel boring or feel like, what am I even doing here? My mind is wandering. God delights in our attempts, even failed attempts. If we feel like they're failed attempts to give our attention to him, he delights in it, and to trust that as we keep creating this space, that he will meet us there. And how much better is the gift of receiving his presence with us and an encounter with him than all of the gifts and all of the food and all of the things that we're striving for. And I say the same things to my kids, the day after Christmas is like the most depressing time, because it was as a kid. And I think I'm learning now, like, oh yeah, you have all this vision of what it's going to be and the things that you're going to get as a kid, and then the day after you realize how it doesn't fill you. And then it's just like this downer. Rather, like, wouldn't it be beautiful instead to create space for a hunger for God in the midst of a busy season, to create space to behold him, to wonder, to enter the story, so that the anticipation of Christmas isn't so much about, the gifts or the food or the things that are happening, but our Jesus himself, which is all obviously what the season is about, and to actually truly behold in wonder, in anticipation, and receiving the amazing presence of Jesus himself. That's worth it.
That's so good. Wow. Well, to begin wrapping us up, is there anything you'd want to say directly to listeners before we begin walking through your book together next week?
I think allowing yourself to slow down is one of the greatest gifts that you can give yourself and the world in this season. Because I think the reality is there's something about the journey that Mary goes on in this pregnancy where God doesn't just show up as a fully formed human, but there's something beautiful that emerges right when she goes through the whole process of Jesus growing in her. And And sometimes it's painful and sometimes it's nauseating and sometimes it's exhausting, but in the end, right? Like she has this gift and honor of being the mother of the Messiah. And I just would say, maybe what this Advent season could look like for you is to just allow yourself the space to allow Jesus to grow within your soul. And with all of the pains of childbirth that comes with. And I do want to give a caveat to listeners who've experienced pregnancy or infancy loss or infertility. This isn't a way to shame them or make it a pain point, because that can be a sore point, as I've been there. But I think the invitation for whoever is listening, man, woman, person who's experienced loss or infertility or not, even bringing him in the midst of that longing and ache can be the nexus point of encounter with God. And I went through several seasons of miscarriages and infertilities even before writing this book, and found even allowing myself to behold Jesus in the longings that I had for a child, where my longings wouldn't be lost on God, because he receives all of it. And to allow him to even carve out space within that loss for my soul to receive him was a deep gift. And so just inviting you all, listeners, to imagine the journey of pregnancy and what it would look like for Christ to be formed in you in this season, and what it would look like to just create some space for that to happen.
Well, this has been such a good conversation, Bette, and I know there's going to be a lot that I'll be reflecting on from our time together. And I also know that listeners are going to want to connect with you after hearing this. So where can people find you? And could you share a little bit about your most recent book and where we can find it?
Absolutely, yeah. So you can connect with me on bettedickinson.com. I'm also on Instagram at Betty_Dickinson, and it's Betty with an E, Dickinson with 2 I's. O-N. And yeah, so the most recent book I launched is called The Art of Winemaking, and it's spiritual flourishing in a productivity-driven culture. And that book is a 6-year journey of walking alongside a friend of mine, Dave Boss, who's a vine dresser or vine farmer, and really getting deep into the questions with John 15 of what does it look like to abide in the vine and to be tended by a loving vine dresser. And in the midst of a hustle culture, and in the midst of a productivity-driven culture, my mind has exploded and expanded around the differences between being tended by a productivity-driven approach to life and an approach where a vine dresser truly seeks our flourishing, where abiding in Jesus is happening in seasons, not just always harvest time. And so, yeah, so that's the book. And I have lots of other retreats and courses and journeys that go with it, because it really embraces the whole cyclical cycle of Christ's life, death, and resurrection and the formation journey. So that's about that. I would love, if people resonated with the Advent book, feel free to check that one out as well.
And I'll be sure to include all the links in the show notes so listeners can go directly to your website and to your books if they're interested. But thank you so much for your time today, Bette. I'm really grateful for you and for this conversation today.
Thank you, Taylor. Thanks for having me.
Isn't Bette wonderful? This conversation was such a gift, and one I've been reflecting on so much since our recording. As I mentioned in our conversation, I've included all the links to Bette's books and other offerings in the show notes. I've also included the link to my Substack, which is a weekly resource email I send out every Wednesday. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts on today's episode, be sure to subscribe. I'd love to have you join this community. I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.